Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, mounting challenges against Argentina's president, Javier Milei.
And I hope that today the Argentine people wake up because we cannot continue enduring so much cruelty.
He was once a chainsaw-wielding rising star, but 2 years into his presidency, are the tables starting to turn? I'm Natasha Del Toro, and this is The Take. Hi. Before we continue with today's episode, please remember to leave us a comment and let us know what you think about today's episode. Or leave us a review on your podcast app and give us a 5-star review while you're there. It helps the show.
Hi, my name's Natalie Alcoba. I'm a journalist based out of Buenos Aires, Argentina, and I write for various international publications.
Thank you so much for joining us on The Take, Natalie. We're really excited to have you with us here today. So Argentina's president, Javier Milei, has portrayed himself as this sort of law and order president, one who's tough on crime. And yet he finds himself amid these massive protests, right? Now, I understand that you were at one of these protests. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about why people were protesting and sort of what was the atmosphere on the ground.
Yeah, so I attended a pretty huge demonstration in the core of Buenos Aires on Saturday. It's a demonstration outside of the National Congress in Buenos Aires, where there's a huge demonstration that's been organized by the feminist movement here to draw attention and really to express outrage over this horrific triple femicide that occurred a few days ago. 3 young women who lived in a low-income neighborhood around Buenos Aires had been lured to a supposed party on a Friday night and then were never seen from again. And a few days later, their bodies were found dismembered in the yard of a house with signs of mutilation that were really, really heinous. I mean, some really graphic details. On top of all that, authorities say that the whole event was live streamed by drug traffickers who are allegedly behind this. Live streamed 2 members of that same gang. And so, I mean, the horrific details kind of galvanized people out onto the streets. So we're seeing a big cross-section of people here today as well. Young people, old, children, families, mostly women, but quite a few men, a lot of men as well. The women's movement in Argentina is a really potent political force, and that has taken on some really key battles in the last 7-10 years around raising awareness around domestic violence, around the legalization of abortion, and has had some key victories.
So there are these massive protests that are happening right now after this horrific crime that you're describing. How did the government respond to the protesters?
I mean, the government in general, its response to demonstrations has been to have a strong show of force on the streets. So this was outside of the National Congress in Buenos Aires. They erected barricades. There was, lines and lines of police and riot officers that were there kind of keeping watch. There have been very violent confrontations at other demonstrations. In this one, there were a few confrontations that involved family members of the victims. But in general, it was a peaceful protest. Thousands of people, mostly women, but a mix of men, women, children, elderly, out on the street, marching, kind of demanding for justice. So that was the vibe
Justice.
there. Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important for us to name these 3 women, the victims of the triple femicide, were Brenda del Castillo, who was 20 years old, Morena Verdi, who was also 20, and Lara Gutierrez, who was only 15 years old.
It seems drug traffickers have more power than the judiciary and the police. Many people demand justice. I don't. I demand truth, as truth is worth more than justice. Justice sometimes decides on one side or the other. But we are here for the truth, to know who was responsible for the crime.
Now, they belong to groups that critics say have been severely impacted by Milei's policies. They were women, they were poor, and as the Secretary General of the Union of Sex Workers of Argentina, Georgina Orellano, pointed out,
today, there are 3 families that are broken, and there will be many more. If we don't mend the social fabric that is torn, if we don't take responsibility for the fact that this doesn't just happen to anyone, stop repeating the classist discourse that it can happen to anyone. No, it happens to the poor. Do you understand? It happens to the poor.
How does this tragedy connect to the broader political moment in Argentina?
One of the points that really demonstrators were making on the street on the weekend was this idea of what happens when the state starts to retreat from more marginalized sectors. So Javier Milei's government has really been defined by austerity measures. He came to power literally like wielding a chainsaw, promising to cut government spending, saying, really talking about, the corruption that was like deep-seated in the government. And when he took office, he said, okay, it's going to be tough for a little while, but this will put us in a better spot in the end. It's meant across the board cutbacks. I believe in his first year in office, he cut real spending by some 30%. And so in that context, when there's a certain gap or a vacuum that exists, other forces move in. And so the argument being that in more marginalized sectors, groups such as drug traffickers are taking a more emboldened position. But I think also, the demonstration and the size of the demonstrations on the weekend also fits into the general shift in political tone for the government of Javier Milei in the last couple of weeks.
Mm-hmm. So that's interesting. So people there and feminist leaders aren't really seeing this as some isolated incident of brutality, but they're seeing this connected to as part of a larger systemic issue connected to his policies. I know that Patricia Bullrich, who is the security minister of an administration that has dissolved the Ministry of Women, Genders, and Diversity, basically downplayed the idea that these were femicides, claiming it could have just as well been 3 men who were murdered. How did that response land?
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, there's still kind of like this disconnect around what it is that women, confront, women confront, on a daily basis, both institutionally, systemically. There's been so much work done in Argentina to raise awareness about the level of violence specifically directed against women. And the reality is that, the statistics really haven't changed a great deal in terms of how frequently a woman is killed here. The level of violence, the type of violence that was inflicted on these women, these are all, factors that point to it being a femicide.
It certainly tells you something about their attitude, right, towards women's issues. And the fact that they would have dismantled this office also seems significant. Right. But from what you're telling me, there's been a real vibe shift in Argentina. This is only 2 years into Milei's tenure, but it's not only this week that has brought that to the fore. Milei and his family have also been engulfed in a corruption scandal, right? And his popularity was at an all-time low in August of 2025. Maybe you could tell me a little bit more about this.
Yeah, there's been like a cascading effect in the last really 2 months. I would say less than 2 months. It's pretty astounding how quickly the tone and the aura around Milei has changed here in Argentina, but also international. Just a few weeks ago, he was still being referred to in international publications as being like the architect of the Milei miracle financially. I'll talk a bit more about that. But things, I think, really started to unravel last month around, as you say, a corruption scandal that implicates the person that is closest to the president, which is his sister, Karina Milei, who has a second-in-command post. He himself refers to her as el jefe, which is the boss, and it's understood that nothing happens with the president without first going through Karina Milei. And last
is she elected to anything, or is she just sort of unofficially,
no,
the jefe?
That's right. No, she has a post, but it's a post that was also enabled because he changed some rules allowing for a family member to occupy this post, which is Secretaría de la Nación. It's a second essentially a second in command post. But no, she's not an elected official, and in fact, she's in the last couple of months taken a bit more of a public role, but for much of this administration has been like this mysterious character who barely speaks in public and who's always kind of in the background, though.
And so what was the corruption scandal about?
Last month, there were voice note audios that were leaked to local media outlets, in which you heard a government official alleging that Karina Milei had accepted bribes in the purchase of medication for people with disabilities. Argentines are not unfamiliar with the idea of corruption in politics. Every term, there are numerous scandals that come out. And in fact, this was one of the galvanizing points for Javier Milei.
Right. So he has several strikes against him at this point. And to be clear, Milei denies any wrongdoing in this case and calls the case politically motivated. Mm-hmm. He also described the accusations against his sister as, quote, clumsy, defamatory operations orchestrated by the opposition. And he criticized the judiciary for focusing on these allegations. Now, earlier in the month, the province of Buenos Aires held its provincial election. Now, it's just a province, but it hosts 40% of the Argentinian census. Milei was claiming that would be the time to defeat the opposition Peronista movement once and for all.
Yes, that's right. And in fact, the opposite occurred. And it's inextricably linked to the corruption scandal as well, because again, suddenly the narrative around the presidency has shifted. And in fact, his party lost very, very badly. Buenos Aires, the province of Buenos Aires is a stronghold of Peronismo, which, side note, is this very strong political force in Argentina that dates back to a former president and military man, Juan Perón, who built this movement around, workers' rights. But this movement has endured, and part of its endurance is its ability to kind of shift between left and right. Right now, it's left, strongly left. Left of center would be the dominant strain. But so this is the strongest bloc in the province of Buenos Aires, but it won even more convincingly. And so that was a major setback for Javier Milei, who had gone out there, purporting that this was going to prove something about his political brand.
After the break, more with Natalie.
Esmond Bradley Martin, one of the world's leading investigators of the illegal poaching trade, was murdered in his own home in Nairobi, Kenya in 2018. To this day, nobody knows who killed Esmond or why. Was it because of his work, or was it a different reason altogether? Hear from Esmond's friends and colleagues in True Crime Reports.
So, Natalie, we can't talk about Argentina without talking about the economy. Javier Milei, when he came into power, he pledged to use radical libertarian ideas to fix the nation's chronic inflation. And I know these austerity measures were very strict and they hit hard. Did it work? Did these austerity measures work? Did his economic approach work to fix the Argentina's economy?
No, I don't think we can say that he's fixed Argentina's economy, but there are certain things that he has made progress on. Now, whether or not that progress is here to stay is another question. And also what that progress actually tells us is another question. So, for example, Argentina has, for years, had very chronic and very high inflation. In the double digits on a monthly basis. It was in the double digits when he took office, and he has been able to drive down that inflation to, it's roughly around 2% a month right now, which is low, very low. But at the same time, the cost of living in Argentina in a whole swath of sectors has gone up for the reasons that I had mentioned before of deregulation, cutting of subsidies. And so on the street, while you have inflation numbers that are really low on the street, for a lot of people, it feels like it's a struggle. And some of his policies are evidently quite fragile. I mean, an arrangement that he had with the International Monetary Fund that has lent billions of dollars to Argentina was to keep the value of the currency, the peso, within a certain range. The peso, again, is a very volatile currency. Following the election that occurred in the province of Buenos Aires, in which he suffered a strong political loss, the value of that peso began to depreciate again very quickly. The markets that had been, endorsing or buoyed by his austerity measures suddenly started to feel like things were shaky. And that led the government, the central bank, to spend, in the span of a couple of days, it spent $1 billion US dollars to keep its currency within this value range that it had agreed to with the IMF. And all of that then led to this meeting with President Trump in the US last week.
Right. And that's exactly where I was going. I mean, beyond Argentina, Milei's closest international ally has been Donald Trump. And as you just mentioned, there's been this talk of a $20 billion bailout package that could come with U.S. backing. How surprising is that, given Milei's sort of slash and burn approach to public spending?
I mean, it certainly reinforces how Javier Milei is the United States' strongest ally in South America at the moment. I mean, I don't know that it's unheard of, this intervention on the part of the United States, but it's certainly pretty extraordinary. Not to mention the fact that, the motivations are explicitly political. The Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said, following that, the fact that they were putting together this plan, they said that the point of it was to try to get Milei through the upcoming, because there are national midterm elections at the end of October. So we had what occurred in the province as a harbinger, perhaps, of something. But now what really matters is the national elections, the midterms, legislative elections, that will give us a real sense of what kind of power Javier Milei has. And clearly the Trump administration is interested in maintaining his strength in the region for a whole host of economic and geopolitical reasons.
I feel like I have to point out, I mean, it is somewhat ironic that, since Milei rose, he's been promising no bailouts, just austerity measures. Yeah. And now here he is getting a huge bailout. Aside from maybe continued support, what does Trump get out of this deal?
I think Trump is shoring up his ally in the region. I mean, the United States is also clearly concerned about the role of China in South America. China is South America's number one trading partner and has been making significant inroads in areas such as, in the north of Argentina, there are critical minerals such as lithium. China has been establishing kind of that supply chain. And the United States wants to, I think, kind of preserve a certain a certain territory, access to minerals, establishing a certain front against that influence. Certainly is part of it.
Right. And they seem to share a lot of the same sort of policies, right? The same sort of approaches. What you've described that Milei's approach has been in Argentina sounds very familiar to what we are seeing from the Trump administration in the United States. But now looking ahead, Milei does not have a majority in Congress right now. You know, he depends on alliances with right-wing legislators, but those don't always hold. Do you think that this shift that you've been describing to me could translate into real results in the legislative elections coming next month?
I mean, the truth of the matter is that things change so quickly in Argentina that what seems to be stable ground this week very well may not be next week, politically, economically, in so many respects. It's undeniable that, while the momentum was on an upswing, a few months ago, now the momentum has changed. Without a doubt, these legislative elections are key, as you say. I mean, he was elected. His party was a party that he formed just 2 years before he himself became president, and it had just a handful of seats, and really has been governing with a coalition of other conservative political blocs. But we're already also seeing the Congress, both the lower House of Deputies and the Senate, reject Milei's policies, certain interventions. The president had sought to veto a spending package, and the Senate rejected his veto. This was on the heels of those legislative losses. So all of that is what we're working with right now, going into those midterm elections. His popularity is at an all-time low, but a lot will depend on the economy as well. I think it's important to remember that what drove people to Javier Milei in the first place was a discontent with previous political parties. So that's a bit what's up for debate right now. Always, it's like, who are you least happy with? It seems to continue to be the conversation.
Natalie, thank you so much for coming on The Take.
Thank you so much, Natasha.